My name is Andy Conti. I'm the director of the Center for Media Innovation at Point Park University, which is hosting this event along with the Point Park University School of Communication. Today's discussion, Polls versus Trolls, Political Campaign Tactics for a 2020 World, is part of this year's Media Innovator Series, which unfortunately, due to the pandemic, of course, we've had to put online. We otherwise would all be at the Pittsburgh Playhouse today, but unfortunately, that's not happening, and hopefully we can get back to that next season. I want to take a moment to appreciate our sponsors. Herbein Co, the accounting firm, has been with us from the beginning, and we're grateful for their help. And the Downtown Community Development Corporation has been a great friend of the CMI and the School of Communication and the Center for Media Innovation, and the speaker series, rather. Now I want to introduce our moderator for today. Daniel Moore is the Washington Bureau Chief for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, where he covers national politics, federal policy, and economic issues for readers in Western Pennsylvania. Previously, he worked for 5 years on the Post-Gazette's business desk in Pittsburgh, covering manufacturing, energy, farming, and other industries. He's a Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting grant recipient and a 2014 graduate of Kent State University. Take it away, Daniel.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone, please keep your audio and video muted until we reach the question and answer period at the end. And if you do have any questions at any point, just post them in the text chat, and the panel will either incorporate them into the conversation or we'll address them at the end. I'd like to introduce our speakers. First, John Brabender. John is the Chief Strategist and Creative Officer for BrabenderCox, which is a national political consulting and advertising firm. He's worked on 5 of Rick Santorum's Pennsylvania congressional races and was Santorum's senior strategist for his 2012 Republican presidential bid. He's also served as a consultant for Tom Ridge, Tom Corbett, and for Rudy Giuliani's 2008 presidential campaign. He's appeared as a guest on CNN and a variety of other news programs. Welcome, John.
Thanks. Happy to be here. Looking forward to it.
Next, we have Abigail Gardner. Abigail is principal at Scottie Public Affairs, a consulting firm she founded in Pittsburgh in 2015. Her clients have included several winning Democratic races in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, including Erica Strasburger for City Council and Lindsey Williams and Pam Iovino for State Senate. She serves on the Allegheny County Democratic Committee and Pennsylvania State Democratic Committee. Nice to have you, Abigail.
Thanks for having me.
Next up, we have Dennis Roddy. Dennis serves as Senior Advisor at ColdSpark Media. He previously served for 4 years as Special Assistant to Republican Governor Tom Corbett after a 4-decade-long career in journalism, including at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and continues to alarm his Democratic siblings by getting Republicans elected. At ColdSpark, Dennis provides messaging expertise, cutting-edge creativity and writing skills that won him a slew of local, state, and national journalism awards. Good to see you, Dennis. How's it going?
Pretty well. I'll feel better in 2 weeks.
We will see what happens. Finally, we have Matt Merriman-Preston. Matt works with Ampersand Consulting, a firm based in Lawrenceville that he's owned and operated since 2006. As a consultant, Matt provides a wide range of services to elected officials, organizations, and candidates in every branch of government at the local and statewide level. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Well, let's jump right in because we have a lot of questions to talk about. I'd like to start with the pandemic because that's at the top of everyone's mind right now. Because you are all consultants, I want to get a sense of how the pandemic has affected messaging and campaign tactics during this election season from the presidential race on down. I mean, how did all of the limits imposed by the pandemic affect campaigning when the pandemic hit in March compared to what normally happens during a major election cycle? And Michael, if you don't mind, let's start with you.
Did you say Michael?
Michael, yes.
Did you mean Matt?
Or Matt, I'm sorry, Matt, yes.
All right, sure. So what we've seen with the pandemic is campaigns have had to adjust on two sides, both the tactical and on the messaging side. Tactically, we've seen with Democratic campaigns more so, I think, initially than Republican campaigns. But both Democrats and Republicans have been impacted by the ability to do less in-person canvassing. Everybody's been limited with fewer in-person events. So tactically, all the campaigns have had to adjust in that way. On the messaging side, I think any campaign tries to ignore the pandemic at their own expense. When that's what's on people's minds, if everything that you're talking about is not going through a filter of how it's affecting people's lives right now, that's been a mistake that I've seen as well.
John, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. It's actually complicated depending on more so where you are. I'm doing, I think I'm in 15 different states, and then I'm the consultant to the vice president, as well as I'm on the Trump ad team. And so early on, the biggest thing was campaigns literally had to shut down their fundraising operations. I'm doing a lot of races around the New York City area, and that's where it got hardest hit. And the last thing you're doing is calling somebody and saying, oh, how's your family, and can you make a contribution? The second thing that happened is they moved a lot of primaries to much later. And so you had this sort of gap where nobody was really campaigning. Third, one of the most complicated parts of this is how do you film ads? Because do you have people with masks on or not masks on? What do you do with the crew? How close? Does everybody get tested? So, for example, we had to film the vice president in Indiana, and everybody had to get tested on set before they could walk on set. So we had to have two of everything, 2 makeup artists, 2 sound people, whatever, so that if one was tested, positive, they're gone. You had to have a backup. And then sort of as Matt said, then you have the messaging part where what everybody thought the messaging was going to be this year, economics, foreign affairs, all of a sudden got cast aside, and you were dealing with real-time issues. What happened that day, what part of it. And you see that Democrat and Republicans want to look at this completely differently because there's different political agendas that are associated with this. So it comes and goes. I mean, certainly when the president got COVID recently, the interest nationally went up again. And so it's very complicated. It's very fluid. And I don't remember an election cycle doing this, I think for 2 million years that I've been involved in that has been anything quite like this. The closest maybe was 9/11. But that was really a different time. It was very singular and it wasn't divisive.
I wonder if the virus or the political messaging around the virus should be different for both parties, though. I'll let Abigail respond to my original question, and then we can go from there.
Sure. And I guess, one thing to flag is I have a lot of clients who are not political candidates, and I'm not an ad maker. So I am a little different, I think, in my business. And one of the clients we've been working with is a paid family and medical leave advocacy group. There's national movements and state movements to try to have policy to cover paid leave. And I think one thing I noticed that changed quite a bit with COVID is, I think to John's point, the day-to-day real life experiences that families were having, and they might have a very different appreciation about issues like paid family leave, paid sick days, access to daycare, access to healthcare, that might have seemed theoretical before, and it maybe became very personal. And so I think messaging that, whether it's a presidential candidate or a state house race that doesn't acknowledge the very real personal struggles families are having and how they're going to take care of themselves and take care of each other right now. If you're not talking about that, I think you run the risk of alienating a lot of people. And I would I think the way that the president's numbers with women have just absolutely imploded implies that maybe Republican message or his message has not really resonated. Encouraging people to just get back to work, sort of doubting if masks are necessary, a lot of like chest thumping, and it felt just like a very masculine, we can just beat the virus if we're strong enough. It doesn't seem like, based on the numbers, has done really well with women voters who are, usually the ones left caring for parents or children or both.
Dennis, what would you say to that point about the messaging the virus, taking the virus seriously? I mean, in some ways, how the candidates have run their campaigns has been the message, right? I mean, Trump has continued to hold large rallies. Joe Biden has been much more reserved this year. What would you say to that point?
I've taken to thinking of this as the Susan Sontag election, where we are dealing with illness as metaphor. Right now, the two parties have almost broken into a dichotomy in which one treats the existence of the disease as sort of a moral agent there to punish, and the other views the cautions as basically some kind of societal pressure meant to keep people down. That's where we get into the mask versus no mask argument, the shall we open up or shall we remain closed sort of tropes. And essentially what we're dealing with here, Daniel, is a pandemic in which we really can't be certain just what's going to happen next, just what's going to transpire. So the best messaging has really been how we're going to deal with the repair after the situation has passed. We're not going to change much more in terms of people's behavior or outlook on this through any kind of political messaging right now. The message has to be what we do afterward.
Does anybody have a response to that? Anybody have anything else?
Well, I think, again, what we're finding, I've seen incredible amounts of poll data on this. Every household looks at this differently. For example, the whole argument, should we go back to school, right? Half the households looked at that as a healthcare question. Are we going to keep our kids safe? Are they going to come home and infect older people? But the other half said, this is an economic question. I can't afford to hire someone to watch my kids all day. If they're not in school, I can't work. And this is a terrible economic burden on our family. And so, you can see that some of these are unprecedented issues. How people contextually look at them are night and day different. And so, but I think Dennis is right. I think people have learned to say, number one, at least we're coping with this. We have figured out, even though it's still present, we now know how to deal with it better. Number two is, I think a lot of people are saying, we keep hearing a vaccine is in the short term. We know there's a lot of progress. We see that even in the city of Pittsburgh. But what are we going to do now to relaunch, and who's best to do that? So I think that's where a lot of this is moving to. In fact, I would argue, I think you'll hear a lot of that on the debate tonight as well.
Well, let's talk about the debate a little bit. John, you mentioned that you've been, or I believe you've been involved in prepping Vice President Pence for debates in the past. Can you talk a little bit about what you would be advising the president or both candidates tonight as they take the stage?
Sure. Yeah, certainly 4 years ago, as part of the debate prep team for the vice president, this time I was less involved because I'm also on the ad team for the president. That's where I was focusing, but did have time to spend time talking to the vice president's staff. And the key on his was just be yourself, be who you are. For the president, I think a lot of people felt that he just went in there last time too hot, too much, that I'm going to just show how weak Joe Biden is. And instead, he turned Joe Biden from somebody who was weak to somebody, in a sense, who looked more like a victim. I think what the president has to do is show that he can do this with his intellect versus Biden rather than might. And so I think that's very important. The other challenging thing is they've changed the topics somewhat again for tonight than what they were supposed to be. They changed the rule format There's a moderator who the president feels is not favorable to them, but favorable to his opponent. So you have this environment where you feel like everything's stacked against you. I think you still got to move that aside and say that may be the case, but that's the hand you're dealt with for tonight. Don't let that mentally affect you. And then I think the key is what I always tell in debate preparation is that any question is really just a prompt to get your message out and answer what you want. It doesn't mean that you have to completely divert from the question, but a lot of times these debates, they just want to see how much information they can get out there, and they want to add one more thing because that green light's still on. Instead, you should start with the most important message that you want. And for the president, he's going to talk a lot about how he created maybe the greatest economy the world's ever seen. And now the economic numbers are coming out that's showing we're starting to do it again. I think he wants to give people hope and say that he has the wherewithal to do that, and contrast that with Biden's record on taxes.
Matt, do you want to respond to that? What would you recommend Joe Biden do tonight in his final debate performance, some 10 days out before the election?
So we are. So now that we're so close to an election, we sort of have an idea, at least what we're seeing in the polling, of where the candidates stand, and at that point where every day is kind of a question of, am I going to improve my standing, or am I going to stay the same? And for the president, any day that he's not improving his standing is not a day for him. He has a lot of ground to move. I think that there's a lot more at stake for the president in this debate. I think his performance in the first debate did not move him in the direction he wants to go, and I think there's a question of whether he can do things differently, take it differently. I know that a week ago, the campaign was praising the moderator. Today, he's talking about the moderator is stacked against him. So I'm not sure that I see the president moving in that direction, but we'll see how he does tonight. In terms of Joe Biden, I think that he's moved into his closing message, which is that he wants to show some, wants to stick with this key message that there's kind of a long-term returning to normal if he's elected. And I think that he needs to present himself as presidential, and there's a lot.
It looks like we may have lost Matt. Nobody else is seeing him, correct?
No, I think we lost him.
He was having some technical problems, it looks like. But I want to ask about the kind of the concept that a lot of people have voted already. 42 million people, last time I checked, across the country have already voted, which is about 20% of the entire 2016 turnout. And, kind of a lot of questions come to mind when I look at that number. But one is there a dearth of undecided voters this election cycle? What have you all been encountering on your campaigns or in your experience on just how polarized the country is? And is there a lack of kind of that independent, undecided swing voter at this point in the campaign cycle? Do you want to answer that, Abigail?
Yeah, I think compared to 2016, it does seem like there's significantly fewer undecideds. And I think there's a couple factors. I think in 2016, Democrats underestimated the long-term baggage that Hillary Clinton was bringing with her, and that there was a really sizable percentage of the population, people probably older than I am because I was a kid in the 90s, and Whitewater didn't, traumatize me the way apparently like millions of Americans can never accept Hillary Clinton and are going to hate her for the rest of their lives. And I think Democrats didn't appreciate that and thought, on the policy and on the substance, she's so much stronger. People will come around even if they had some memories of unpleasantness. And it turns out they didn't come around, and there were a lot of people who couldn't get over it. And maybe they were undecided until the end, and in the end they couldn't pull the trigger for her. Or they had some third-party options that you could sort of talk yourself into believing voting for Jill Stein or voting for Gary Johnson was like, I could never vote for Hillary. I'm not going to vote for Trump. So that's an acceptable, that's an acceptable choice. It seems like in 2020, the president had 4 years to show everybody exactly who he was. So there's not that much left to the imagination now. And there's not as much of a strong third party option. So the polling I've seen implies that there's very, very few undecided voters left. And I think the point Matt was making about how baked the election really is with this many people already voting, we're down to 2 or 3% maybe of people left to make up their mind. And maybe both candidates split that vote. Maybe those people don't vote, but it doesn't necessarily seem like, 10% like I think we were seeing still at the end in 2016.
Yeah, Dennis, does that change, how does that change the dynamics of a campaign? I mean, does that change the timeline for, when you run certain ads or what type of communications you put out when during a cycle? You are still muted, Dennis.
There was almost a popular demand for that. But right now, what we saw is a tremendous number of mail-in ballots, at least applications. One of the ways in which it changed our strategy was we went and found out who had applied for mail-in ballots and began texting them and began targeting them with a combination of direct mail and just general outreach. Also, because the software has become so sophisticated, you can tell whether these applicants are going to be persuadable. In other words, if they're hard Democrats, okay, we're not likely to get that vote. So we're going to concentrate on certainly, if you're an independent and you applied for a mail-in ballot, you heard from my firm by now. The other reality that we're facing is that the Democrats have better field. There's just no getting around it. They have better field work. They know how to do outreach. They have public sector unions doing a heavy amount of outreach on their behalf. So it's likely that they are going to organize people that otherwise might not vote and get mail-in ballots, get them to do mail-in ballots. So we, on a Republican side, we're faced with a double task. One, reaching out to anybody that might be doing mail-in ballots. And secondly, running our campaigns and running them hard right up to Election Day, because just as we've seen sort of an ideological divide emerge over the pandemic, there are going to be a large number of Republican and undecided voters out there who are just out of pure stubbornness going to insist on going to the polls on November 3rd, and so it just doesn't end. From what polls I have seen in state level races, I would say though right now we've got about 5% undecided.
John, do you want to?
Yeah, let me talk about it on a couple of levels. Two things. Let's talk about the sort of early voting process. The interesting thing is it's different in every state, whether you can do in person, do mail, when it starts, when it finishes. And so in every state that I'm working in, we have to time it specifically to that state. So if we know early voting is going to start on a Monday, we ramp up our advertising in that state right before then, because what happens is they come into waves. There's like the first time they can do it, there's a big number that come in and then they're gone. We also pretty much know who voted early and we can see what's going on. And as you would expect, the people who are most likely to vote early are the ends of the spectrum because they're the most engaged voters. Well, this year it's a little bit different because the president has been sort of downplaying your vote. If you mail it in, it may never get there, and that there's too much corruption and those things. So we're finding on the right side, more people are waiting to the end. I think that's what Dennis was alluding to, that to show up on Election Day. So what happened in most states in the very early voting, we were seeing Democrats run up these sort of really big numbers. pretty much what was expected. But as the early voting started to go, the numbers started to decrease for the Democrats and increase for turnout among Republicans, not to a normal rate, but closer to a normal rate. So that seems to be what's going on there. As far as the fluidity, what we're really saying is how many votes are in play. Who are we really talking to? And it probably is someplace more in the 6 to 9% vote. But in polling, you also have one other thing with Trump. You have what's called the shy voter. And there's been some discussion, is that a myth or is that real? And we see it very much as real in certain states, particularly Rust Belt states. If you come, for example, from Western Pennsylvania and you're in a Union Democrat household and some stranger you don't know calls you on the phone and asks you who you're voting for, you're much more unlikely to say, oh, I'm voting for the Republican, because you're afraid you're going to get a second phone call right after that. And so we saw that happen in 2016, that Trump's numbers seem to overperform all the polls, and people think that's one of the reasons. And right now what we're seeing in Pennsylvania, if you go to Real Clear Politics today, you'll see that Biden's up by about 3 points. In fact, it's closed from about 7 to 3 over the last 2 weeks. I think if I'm the Trump campaign, which I'm part of, that you look at that and saying, if we're 3 or 2 points down going into Election Day, that might be fine. We might still win Pennsylvania because there sort of is this. The second thing that's unique about Pennsylvania is there's been this organic growth of Republican votes versus Democrat votes, which is unusual for a Rust Belt state. So you not only have to look at what percent are truly undecided, you've got to try to filter and factor into that what percent maybe aren't telling the truth when they're getting a poll question. And it's sort of a guess, and that's why you see polls all over the place, is because people are making different assumptions on those surveys.
Abigail, have you had encounters with shy Trump voters in your experience working on various campaigns?
You know, right after Election Day 2016, I was sitting in at a labor council meeting to talk to them about a program I sit on the board of that recruits and trains Democratic women lower down the ballot to run for office. And there was a really frank and honest conversation at that meeting from labor leaders saying that, you know, their guys didn't vote for Hillary Clinton, that they think issues like transgender people being able to use a bathroom that they're comfortable in, or, you know, issues about gun control or gun safety is a threat to them, and the Democratic Party has moved into a direction they don't relate to anymore. And so that's real, that, you know, people who are in unions and maybe were Democrats, registered Democrats, but don't really vote Democrat anymore, like, those are real people. I don't believe that they're shy, though. I mean, I think they tell their union leaders that they're not going to vote and that they don't care. I don't think unions are not a monolith, right? Like, there's a lot of different kinds of unions. There's teachers and nurses, and there's building trades, and lots of different kinds of unions. I do not get the sense that they're shy about telling their leadership how they're going to vote. I don't get the sense that they're shy telling pollsters how they're going to vote. I think when I drive around and see lawn signs in Allegheny County or outside of Allegheny County and big 6-foot signs or whatever, I don't think people are shy about saying that they're going to vote for Trump if they're going to vote for Trump. I was wondering from the Republicans, though, if I could just ask them a question. What is their reaction to President Trump telling voters not to vote by mail? Like, do you find that helpful?
Well, I'm on record saying that I wish we would have said, we don't think the system is right, but we're going to beat the Democrats at their own game. Instead, we didn't do that. I didn't feel, I think we felt saying, hey, just make sure you vote on Election Day. And there's a few problems with that. One is, I think because of the turnout, the lines are going to be remarkably long on Election Day. So you're counting on people, instead of staying a half hour in line, to stay 2 hours in line. And hopefully everybody will do that. So, but here's the other thing that we find that's unique about Trump in a state like Pennsylvania. He got white, non-college educated women voters. He got 63% of the votes in Pennsylvania from them. As you said earlier, part of that was sort of this visceral response to Hillary Clinton that Biden doesn't necessarily bring out. So that was number one. But also what we find is there's a lot of voters in Rust Belt states particularly, and a lot of Democrat voters who do not look at Donald Trump as a Republican. They actually look at him as more of an independent voter or independent candidate, where they like his agenda a lot. And what sometimes some voters find offensive, and that's Trump's style, they actually find it likable because that makes him less like a traditional politician. So they feel like, I can believe him. So there's something paradoxical about that. But that's why these races, I mean, just go after this call, go look at Real Clear Politics and look. Yesterday, there was a number of surveys out in Wisconsin. One had the president up. I think other ones had him down 5 or 6. There was one that had him tied in Texas yesterday, which it was by Quinnipiac, and I think everybody thought it was ridiculous. Pennsylvania, they ranged from a 1-point race yesterday to like a 8-point race of the ones that came out. On national polls, a lot of them are at 4 or 5 points. CNN, I think, had it at 11 yesterday. Every survey starts with an assumption. Male, female, who do we include as far as likelihood to vote? Do we go by their voting record, or do we ask them? Is it all voters, likely voters, or just everybody? And that's why these polls are all over the place, plus the method of which they use to call. What percent sales are cell phones? And so what I would say to most people, don't look at the aggregate, start looking at the trend lines, because that's what we learned in 2016. At the very end, Trump started to trend, but he was not ahead in Wisconsin, not ahead in Pennsylvania, not ahead in Michigan, yet he won those states. And so same with Florida and Ohio. Watch what's going on with trends, not as much what the aggregate number is.
John, to Abigail's point about the messaging around the actual election and election administration, this was a Pew Research Center poll way earlier this year that said just 14% of people were very confident that the presidential election would be conducted fairly and accurately, and another 45% were somewhat confident. So, and that was well before any of the Postal Service cuts were made over the summer, and a lot of that stuff happened. I mean, what would you say? And this is, I guess, a question to all of you, but regardless of political party, what should candidates be telling voters about the election to instill confidence that their candidate, that their vote will be counted and the election will be administered correctly?
Well, I'll just start by saying, think back to 2000, when there was basically one county in one state in Florida that we had all the hanging chads and all that type of stuff. And it was a national, outrage on both sides and lawyers, and it went to the Supreme Court. That was one state and one region. This time, the potential for this race to go on for months after the election would not be the least bit unusual. I mean, you saw the Supreme Court this week sided with Pennsylvania it was basically a tied opinion, because there's only, 6-6 members on the court right now, where Pennsylvania can count well after Election Day. And I don't even believe they start counting a lot of these votes until Election Day. So if like a lot of people think this is going to come down to Pennsylvania, my gosh, we might not know for a long time. And we see how divisive this country is. We see how there are many, and I think there's blame to go around with everybody, how there can be violence on both sides. I do worry a lot that this has right now the potential to become a nightmare for this country. And I sure hope it doesn't. And I think the leaders themselves have a tremendous responsibility to guard the process, but also guard the safety of everybody and the rhetoric that's out there.
It looks like we have Matt. Matt is back. Matt, we were talking about the election and just instilling confidence. A lot of voters think that their vote will not be counted, or that the election won't be conducted fairly or accurately. What would you like to hear from candidates on the campaign trail?
I think it's important, and what I am advising my candidates is to is to work to reassure voters that they should feel confident in the process. We know that in Allegheny County, where there have been problems, the county has been transparent about what they were and how to fix them. And we want voters to feel confident. This should not be the type of issue that has a partisan split, even though a lot of times we can see that. When it comes to vote by mail, and I know we were talking about that a little bit earlier. It's pretty amazing to me how quickly we've gone from. You couldn't really say that expanded mail voting was going to benefit Democrats or Republicans more. But what we're seeing now is an enormous gap between who's participating in that and who feels comfortable in that. We're seeing it both in requests and in ballots that are returned, and so it does present certain challenges, I think, for Republican organizers, but it presents challenges for everybody when they're getting different messages about how secure they should feel with the systems that we have in place.
Dennis, do you think that there's evidence of widespread voter fraud in Pennsylvania or across the country? Because President Trump in his campaign has repeatedly said that there is voter fraud, which may be contributing to people's perceptions that their vote won't be counted.
I don't know that there is widespread voter fraud. I know that as far back as 1970, the Pennsylvania Crime Commission was finding Nikita Khrushchev, Marilyn Monroe, and I'm not making this up, Lassie registered to vote in Philadelphia because we have so many register and be paid by the registrant schemes that go on over the years. The reason there is any misgiving right now expressed about the system of voting, at least in Pennsylvania, it is that we've sort of thrown out the election laws. We have a Supreme Court that, absent any legislation or any precedent, decided that we'll keep counting votes that are received days afterward. We have a question about whether the governor will, in fact, allow them to begin canvassing the votes, the mail-in votes, the morning of the election, which frankly would be a good thing for everybody because those votes will be counted, but the election code doesn't call for that. We're no longer legislating these things. We're doing them by diktat and by judicial fiat, and that's why people are losing faith, because rules are changing around them. They don't know exactly what is happening around them, but they know that things are changing, and when you change an institution such as the election, people get skittish.
Does anybody have anything else to add on that question?
Well, I think a couple things. I mean, when the president tells them that they shouldn't trust it and they should be skittish, it's not like they came up with that idea on their own. That was a message that was repeated over and over again on social media and television, and he continues to say. And I think there has been a lot of changes, and they were coming, and then the pandemic made it more complicated. I don't think it's necessarily fair to lay it entirely at the feet of the court and the governor when there's a Republican-held legislature that doesn't want to make a good faith effort to make voting easy and accessible. And voter fraud is not an issue.
Sorry, that's not so.
Okay, but it is, and voter fraud isn't an issue. There's no evidence that voter fraud is a widespread issue. There's only evidence that people say it's an issue as a way to continue to try to suppress votes, and they do that through lots of different tactics to peel away how easy and accessible it is to vote. But if you accept that when you make voting easy and accessible, that doesn't increase fraud, because voter fraud, when it does happen, seems very small. And usually, anecdotally, I saw a story about someone in Luzerne County who tried to register to vote for their mother who had been deceased, and that was a Republican. So, if it is committed, I don't think it's only committed on one side. But once you accept it's not really happening, I think the question should be, why are we not exploring every way to make voting easy and accessible. Why is it that we are not making drop boxes more accessible? Why is there anyone standing in the way of counting votes earlier? Why are people trying to challenge signatures and get ballots thrown out if signatures don't match from voter registration cards from, a decade ago? So I do think it's a lopsided attack on voting rights and not really a voting fraud issue. I think that's just used as a red herring.
Go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, well, if we're going to talk about ballot access, or if we're going to talk about opening up the elections, then the Democrats should not have been suing Ralph Nader and suing the Green Party candidate a decade ago and continue to make efforts to bump people off the ballot. This is Allegheny County. I sat in the courtroom and watched as the Democratic Party arranged challenges on every signature they could find on a nominating petition as to whether signatures on the ballot envelope ought to match the registration card. I'm left wondering why we have registration cards then. As for legislation, that's how you change the voting law. And if you do it with the governor stepping in, with the courts stepping in, then you're going to lose the faith of the electorate because they're not going to trust institutions that change the rules on other institutions. And as for the efficacy of the mail-in ballots, they seem to work very, very well. My daughter, in fact, voted twice by mail-in ballot after the county sent out 29,000 ballots that had her voting in the wrong district.
Yeah, and look, this argument that Democrats, I hear this all the time. They say, all we want is to give everybody their right to vote. So what did they do in California in 2018? They did ballot harvesting, where they could go around and just an average citizen could collect all the votes they want and take them, which is actually legal in California. Okay, then they went to court in North Carolina to stop that from being illegal, because they felt the Republicans could do a better job at it than they could in North Carolina. And so if this really came down to this honest argument of we want to let everybody vote, then they shouldn't be playing one lawsuit in one state and a completely different lawsuit on the opposite side in another state. So I do think that creates a certain amount of hypocrisy when the Democrats do start trying to make that argument.
So in Pennsylvania, when we had mail-in voting passed this year, it was it passed with more Republican votes than Democratic votes. It was neither a Democratic or Republican issue, so But what we have now, when in terms of the pre-canvassing and the ability, you have Republicans and Democratic county officials who have been asking the legislature for a fix that will allow for pre-canvassing. And it's the Republicans that have failed to pass the bill to make that happen. And so I don't think this is a both sides issue when it comes to making the elections fair and transparent in Pennsylvania.
Anybody else want to respond to that? That's a big question. I'm going to be following this as long as it takes back in Pittsburgh. Covering the election is no longer just covering one night of action. It's probably going to be days and days. Yeah, I mean, the fact of the matter is we're in a global pandemic. And as of right now, states are trying to figure out how to make sure that people can vote safely. Is there kind of a sweet spot for how many in-person polling locations versus, how much to expand ballot drop boxes? I know in Texas, I believe they're down to one drop box per county, which seems like it might be a burden on people trying to vote. I mean, how do you, anybody can take this, but how do you see kind of making the process of voting safe in this election without infringing on rights, without introducing fraud? Is there a sweet spot? John?
Well, the difficulty is certainly there for this reason. And in most states, what they're doing is they're wiping down every machine after somebody votes. So now you've added into the process something that takes a significant amount of time. At the same time, you're likely to have record turnout. And so I do think what I worry about more than anything is people getting frustrated with the process and not voting because they leave. And I think that would be the real sort of detriment to this country if that were to happen. So there's going to be a lot of problems that we're not used to. They're certainly going to exist, and people need to know that ahead of time. But I just hope people are going to be patient enough and understand the value of their vote is a great opportunity for any citizen, as well as a great responsibility. Understand ahead of time there's going to be complications, and basically clear your schedule because you're going to be there for a while.
Anybody else?
In the other thing that they had to figure out, so in the primary where we had consolidated polling places, which we don't have in the general election, part of the problem at that stage in the pandemic was having enough trained election workers to be able to run the polls. Does not seem to be a problem at this point that they've seen in Allegheny County to be able to figure that out. So, I would err on the side of it's always best to have polling location, the normal polling locations, which are in or close to precincts of the voters who are voting. But in the case where it's critical for the infrastructure to be able to have trained election workers working there who are doing that. I think Allegheny County has done a good job, and a lot of voters have stepped up to volunteer to be election workers this time. There seems to have been enough time to train to make sure that enough polling places are open.
Well, I want to ask a question about down ticket races, since we're all in Western Pennsylvania, and obviously we have a big race in Connor Lamb and Sean Parnell in the 17th Congressional District. I want to ask, I guess more generally, are there political risks and benefits in, if you're a down ballot candidate, tying yourself to somebody on the national level like President Trump or like Joe Biden, because both Sean Parnell and Connor Lamb have done that very much so in the 17th district. From your perspective as consultants, consulting with state and local candidates, how do you see that dynamic? What are the risks and benefits of doing that?
Well, a great deal is what congressional district you're in, to be honest with you. So if you're sort of a, Fitzpatrick running for Congress in the Philadelphia region, where the president's numbers are not necessarily that strong, you try to run much more independent. There'll be candidates in the western side of Pennsylvania that will benefit. I mean, a good example is, Mike Kelly, congressman for Erie, all the way down almost to Pittsburgh, but includes Butler. The president went up to Erie 2 nights ago, and on a day's notice, 22,000 people showed up, for a rally. And the president won Erie County last time, and he'll certainly win Crawford and Mercer and Butler. And so, what you're going to find not only in Pennsylvania, but I'm seeing this in a lot of races that I'm working in, candidates have to make tough decisions and say, okay, where am I and how important is the president? And what we're not seeing are Republicans running. I don't know of a single Republican running away from the president. The question is, how much are they trying to act as an independent versus somebody who's only running as the running mate of the president? But it'll be places in this country where it has great benefits, and it'll have places in this country where it doesn't. Senator Cory Gardner in Colorado is running now in a very tough race because the president's numbers aren't good enough. Other places, Republicans are running well ahead of where they probably normally would be because the president's popular. So it really varies a lot by geographic region. And you mentioned the Connor Lamb race here. I was with a CNN producer, and they were asking me what races should they watch early on election night to get a sense of where things are going. And I listed that as one of the races because I think it's one of those ones where we're going to learn quickly about Pennsylvania in seeing how that race is going.
To Abigail or Matt, do your candidates seek to tie their opponents to President Trump or other issues or trends on the national level in state and local races?
I don't. Go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, I agree with what John was saying about how important geography is in determining what you try to do with it. One of the challenges is increasingly you're seeing less and less ticket splitting where folks will vote for somebody from one party for president and somebody else down ballot. That's becoming less common to be able to do that. So it is a challenge for candidates to sometimes present themselves independent of national politics, and how much you try to do that or not. I completely agree with John. Depends on where you are.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think I've seen some of those attacks fall kind of flat where it doesn't feel that realistic to tie like a state house candidate who's never run for office before to, Kamala Harris or something. Like, it's a very tenuous connection. And I think on those down ballot races, people just serve themselves better when they're trying to raise their name ID and carve out some kind of awareness about them and their brand and their campaign, that you're probably better served down ballot to just be specific about your community and what your vision is and try to introduce yourself and what you actually want to do. But I mean, I agree with Matt, people aren't really splitting the ticket. So if you're in Allegheny County and you're in a sort of highly educated suburb where Republicans are fleeing the president, then I think as a down ballot state house, Democratic candidate, like you're served by that, even if you're not trying to tie your Republican opponent to the president.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed in congressional races, or at least that I always pay attention, is every survey we get back, to me, there's three critical numbers. I'll look at the ballot for president, I'll look at the ballot for Congress, but I'll also look at what's called the generic ballot, where people just ask, are you for the Republican or are you for the Democrat and voting for Congress? And very often what you will see is those numbers fluctuate together. The president's numbers fall, the generic ballot falls, the congressional number falls. If the president starts coming back up, the generic starts coming back up, and the House member starts coming back up. And so they certainly is a relationship between those races. And I can tell you in all the races I'm involved, we pay a lot of questions or attention to that because we always want to know if there's movement up or down. Was it something specific to the race or was it environmental? And probably 80% of the time it's environmental.
Interesting. As a reminder, we're kind of entering the final minutes here. I do not see any questions in the chat, but if anybody has questions, feel free to write them in or let me know some other way. I guess I'd like to just get your perspective, each of you, on what you expect will happen in the election at the presidential level. What do you think the outcome's going to be? When do you think we're going to know? John, why don't we start with you?
I like I said, the only way you're going to know early is if somebody wins by a lot. So, let's just get that mindset. I think the race has fundamentally changed significantly in the last 10 days, quite frankly. I think the president has tightened up in all the key battleground states. I'm not sure he's not where he needs to be on election day yet, but he's similar or better to where he was at 2016 at this point. And so I do think this debate matters. I think it's a question whether the whole thing with Hunter Biden becomes a real issue or doesn't. All these type of things as far as can the president keep tightening up. And frankly, we've learned that the president, if he stays on message, does very well. If he gets down a rabbit hole of talking about an issue that isn't one of the bigger issues to his benefit, then it can put a pause on everything. And so I think that's a factor. And then, I do think people are still taking a look at Biden and trying to figure out, is he frail, is he weak, or is he the Joe Biden of 30 years ago? And I think that that sort of report card is still out. So, my expectation is the race is even going to tighten closer. And I think probably going into Election Day, people are going to look at this and saying that, it's almost a 50-50 race.
Abigail, do you want to go next?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting perspective. I think, the president's performance in his first and only debate so far was pretty unhinged, and his polls really suffered immediately after. So if he turns in another performance tonight, I think, given the millions of Americans who've already voted, the fact that it seems like frequently Biden's over 50% in a lot of polls, I'm not on the President Trump's ad team, so I'm sure John knows quite a bit that I don't about the state of the race and if things have fundamentally changed in the last 10 days. From my perspective as an outsider, I had not seen a fundamental change, and it seemed like things have actually been incredibly steady given all of the wild things that have happened in the environment. It doesn't actually feel like, to me, that the polls have changed that much for quite a while, that Biden started up and he's still up, and a debate performance didn't change that. The president having COVID and having a really strong steroid regimen right after COVID, where he seemed to be kind of saying some interesting things, maybe changed it a little bit. But no, it actually feels remarkably steady to me. And with everybody who's already voted, if something dramatic doesn't change in the next 10 days, then I think Vice President Biden is in a good position to win. Now, maybe it takes a few weeks to count all the votes and figure that out, but I am hopeful, cautiously hopeful, that that'll be the outcome.
Dennis, do you want to go next?
Yeah, at this point, sorry, John, I think that it's not likely that Trump is going to be able to pull from behind on this thing. But I think that part of what has happened in all of this election is that it has become infotainment to people more than it has become informative. And to an extent, that's always going to be the case. I've always told my clients, people aren't always going to remember what you said. They're going to remember how you made them feel. And at this point, Trump, has provided the refresher of rage that some people on the left sometimes need for the same reason that I have a lot of friends who still watch Fox News, even though they don't believe it. We're going to see, I think the real risk we have here is that this is likely to be, by whatever measure, a change election. And that is to say, it's either going to reaffirm a direction the country took 4 years ago with a particular force, or it's going to reject that and reject it soundly. In change elections, the people that tend to fall are the moderates, the people who stand in the middle, the people who sort of become the unifying forces. We've seen that in election after election. That, I will say, is not a prediction. I'm very poor at predictions, but it is my fear that what's going to happen now is that the vast middle, that I think actually tends to be what gets things done in a democracy, could very much suffer in this outcome.
Matt, what are your thoughts on this? What's your prediction?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised to see some tightening in the last few days. Sometimes that happens. Where it stands now, I'd certainly rather be Joe Biden than Donald Trump at this point. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some tightening. What I'm looking for when I'm watching results on this election day to find out if we know results that night. Two states in particular, Florida and Arizona, we should be able to see results that night. If Biden were to win either of those, and certainly if he were to win a Texas state, which will probably also have results that night, then I think almost certainly, even though we may not have counts from a number of the other states, we'll have a pretty good idea that he's going to win there. If if Trump were to win all 3 of those states, we could be looking at a coin flip. We could be looking at longer count times in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, which are going to take longer to vote. But outside of that, I'm taking a look. Political Report just moved the Pennsylvania State House, rated it to a toss-up. I'm going to be looking for whether control changes there. I'm going to be looking for whether Democrats are able to flip the state Senate. In terms of the U.S. Senate, there's a lot of surprisingly close and competitive races, and we may on election night get an idea of whether control of the U.S. Senate is changing either.
As Dennis says, it will probably be a change election. There will be a lot of toss-up races, and I don't see any questions. So I just want to thank everybody for joining the panel, and I'm endlessly fascinated by the election. I'm really excited to come back to Pittsburgh and cover it on the ground or via Zoom, most likely. If there's nothing else, I appreciate everyone's time and attention. And I guess that concludes it. Stacy?
Thanks so much. That's as the graduate assistant from the Center for Media Innovation, who helps put this event together. Again, just wanted to say thank you to all our speakers and to everyone who attended today, and to follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Point Park CMI, and then you'll be able to find out more about our other events, including our upcoming next Media Innovator Speaker Series event featuring Salita Zito. And you can always sign up for our email newsletters at tinyurl.com/CMI newsletters. And that way you'll be the first one to know when things are coming up. Again, thanks to everyone, and have a great afternoon.